Welcome to More News from Nowhere, a series in which we'll walk through some leftist text, offer one analysis we can, and then try to investigate the theory and practice that might lead to a better world. This first episode will focus on a book that's central to a lot of leftists, especially those identifying as anarchists or anarcho-communists, Peter Kropotkin's 1892 The Conquest of Bread. Now, I myself do identify as such, but I have a dirty little secret. I've never read the Bread book. I have, however, been neck-deep in a lot of Marxist-Leninist theory for a while now, and it's left kind of a bad taste in my mouth, so let's see if Papa Kropotkin can remedy that. This episode will consist of two parts. Part 1 is pretty much just a summary of the text with selected quotes, etc., and Part 2 will offer an analysis of the reading as such. So, let's begin with Chapter 1 of The Conquest of Bread. So in Part 1 of Chapter 1, Kropotkin begins by setting an argument for communism based on a broad historical view of capital. The argument's basically that every new development is actually the culmination of a vast historical development. The result of this claim is that all the capitalist giants of industry lose their claim to their property. The capitalist is not a dwarf standing on the shoulders of giants. In fact, they're dwarfs standing on the shoulders of generations of workers who built the entire superstructure that allows capital to operate. So therefore, an argument for the communal ownership of that property. So we could consider the vast wealth created in the United States that was built completely on the backs of slave labor. The master class claims the benefits of that labor and celebrates their supremacy. Or on a smaller scale, every technological development does not spring fully formed Athena-like from the mind of brilliant capitalists, despite the West's fascination with the narratives of great men. Those developments are the product of the work of hundreds of thousands of unknown men and women who improved failed technology, failed themselves, until one person finally manages to monetize the technology. It's essentially a communal view of intellectual property that expands to literally everything made by human hands. So in Part 2 of Chapter 1, he tells a pretty familiar story by now of the great excesses when that property is seized through war, imperialism, and other forms of oppression. The wealth of the nation, once again, is not the product of the capitalist class, but the sum total of generations of labor by the working classes, now stolen and protected by a legal system designed by and for the ruling class. He then goes on to make a global view that rhymes quite well with the 21st century. Quote, millions of human beings have labored to create the civilization upon which we pride ourselves today. Other millions, scattered throughout the globe, labored to maintain it. Without them, nothing would be left in 50 years but ruins. There's not even a thought or an invention which is not common property, born of the past and the present. End quote. Consider how the wealth of the Western world is built on the exploitation of the global South, and how quickly that would crumble if that oppression suddenly ceased. So, moving into Section 3, he focuses on the consequences of this injustice. Quote, the railways, which would be useless as so much old iron without the teeming population of Europe, its industry, its commerce, and its marts, belongs to a few shareholders, ignorant perhaps of the whereabouts of the lines of rails which yield them revenues greater than those of medieval kings. And if the children of those who perished by thousands while excavating the railway cuttings and tunnels were to assemble one day, crowding in their rags and hunger to demand bread from the shareholders, they would be met with bayonets and grape shot to disperse them and safeguard vested interests. End quote. He then goes on to share the essential Marxist observation that the capitalist system resembles, on a structural level, the feudal system. Different names, but the relationships are very much the same. Quote, we cry shame on the feudal baron who forbade the peasant to turn a clod of earth unless he surrendered to his lord a fourth of his crop. We call those the barbarous times. But if the forms have changed, the relations have remained the same, and the worker is forced, under the name of free contract, to accept feudal obligations. For, turn where he will, he can find no better conditions. Everything has become private property, and he must accept or die of hunger. The result of this state of things is that all our production tends in the wrong direction. Enterprise takes no thought for the needs of the community. Its only aim is to increase the gains of the speculator. Hence, the constant fluctuations in trade, the periodical industrial crises, each of which throws scores of thousands of workers on the streets. End quote. He then goes on to describe the capitalist ideology, though he doesn't use that word, which is the lie that we tell to justify this system and its horrors, making the claim that this constant lying about the state of affairs has a detrimental effect on all who live under the system, essentially corroding truth itself. So, he comes to a very Marxist conclusion by very non-Marxist road. Quote, "Thus, the consequences that spring from the original act of monopoly spread through the whole of social life. Under pain of death, human societies are forced to return to first principles, the means of production being the collective work of humanity. The product should be the collective property of the race. Individual appropriation is neither just nor serviceable. All belongs to all. All things are for all men, since all men have need of them. Since all men have worked in the measure of their strength to produce them, and since it's not possible to evaluate everyone's part in the production of the world's wealth." Marx gets there through an economic argument, playing by capital's rules, pointing out the internal flaws and contradictions and the inequalities within that system. Kropotkin instead brings an ethical argument. The fruits of the production should belong to all because production itself relies on all. It's a matter of fairness. This leads to the chapter's final revolutionary cry, where the proletariat abandons cries for jobs or even just greater fruit of their individual labor. Instead, the anarchist cry is the cry of the right to well-being for all. And that brings us to the end of chapter 1. So now in part 2, I'll offer what analysis I can. Obviously, chapter 1 doesn't take us too deep. There's not, it's fairly, what Kropotkin wants to say is fairly on the surface. It doesn't require a whole lot of digging. It does set the stage, though, with a fairly unique argument against private property. While Marx is explicitly using the master's tools against him, Kropotkin isn't interested in playing that game. Now, one question is this analysis convincing, and to whom? I mean, Marx's analysis is extensive, scientific, hopelessly detailed, but I don't know that it ever changed the mind of a capitalist, and Kropotkin's argument almost certainly won't either. Now, when it comes to converting the proletariat, this argument might be more accessible and simpler. I kind of wonder that Kropotkin doesn't lean more heavily on the fact that capitalist wealth is the product of outright theft and imperialist violence. He kind of just states it in a matter-of-fact way and just moves on. It's hardly central to his argument. Instead, he leans more on the fairness argument. So, as we move forward through this book, I have a couple of guiding questions that I'm going to be keeping at the back of my mind, and that one of them is, in a world where the economy is even more global than it was at the time of the book's writing, how do small-scale, decentralized communities function? For example, I live in Wyoming. Food does not grow here. The community is desperately interconnected with communities across the country and across the world, or we would not be able to survive. So what would an anarcho-communist community look like here? How would it function? How might we begin to think about how we would build genuinely democratic systems? Because that's what this is all about, guys. All right, please join us next time where we will investigate Chapter 2 of The Conquest of Bread. Thank you.